What we're going to get into today is we were talking last week, and we got really heated, I feel like, in the hot take when we were talking about Clemson and their schedule, and then we brought up a name, and it's a name that's a very polarizing name in the sport, and that is Florida State.
Yes.
I said there's no way they're going to beat Clemson this year. You said you're not even giving them a chance, and I said not even a 1/16 of a chance. I'm not doing it. So with that being said, we're going to be breaking down Florida State. We in this segment, we're going to obviously take a look at, what happened last year with them. What are they looking like this year? What do we expect? And so, yeah, Chris, what are your thoughts about Florida State?
You know what, man? And it's not me hating on Florida State, right? I want to get that across. Florida State, dude, is a team I feel like every year since I've been a kid, and I grew up in the 90s watching a lot of football, Florida State, Miami, Nebraska. You throw those teams out there, man, and it's just like those teams were so crazy good and so hyped up. And I remember watching the Florida games, right? And I'm going to bring it back here a little bit before I answer that question, but Miami, Florida State, there were just so many fucking dynamic athletes on both sides of the ball. I remember watching ABC like it was yesterday, watching those games, and Charlie Ward and guys like that, Danny Warfel. I mean, I could get into this whole slew of guys that were just big name college athletes at that time, and being so hyped up because the talent on the field there was so much different than like when Nebraska was playing, right? Because I'm a Nebraska fan in the Big 12, and because there was just so much speed on both sides of the ball, right? And when I hear Florida State to this day, they still got the same helmets, the same unis, like. I love it. I always, Bobby Bowden, like I hold them such to a crazy high standard that I always put them up there in my brain. I always do because I'll just remember what I know, and what I know is what I know, and what I don't know is what I don't know. But this year, we're talking about 2023, and I think right off the rip, man, we all know what they returned this year after last year, right? You got they return a shit ton of guys offensively. They bring back Jordan Travis, you got Trey Benson, I believe, is a running back, and then you got Johnny Wilson, who's a receiver, right? These guys should put up some crazy, crazy numbers. I'm a big fan, obviously, at the quarterback with Jordan Travis this year. I think he's going to have a big year. I think I put him in my top 5 or 6 as far as quarterbacks and Heisman Trophy, candidates this year. He's gonna put up some numbers, man. The guy's I use the word dynamic athlete, I feel like every freaking podcast, but like this guy is upper echelon. He's up there. So as far as the preview goes to this, man, I think their defense is going to be, I think a lot of it relies on that defense, especially in the ACC. And if they can compete and be, I guess the word I want to use is sound, against the Clemsons of the world. And those teams over there, UNC, if they can be in that, I think their offense is going to put up enough points. And I'm very big on returning people, right? Especially in the college landscape today. This is the same group of kids, same squad as last year for the most part. I think they're going to put up big numbers on offense is what I'm going to say here. And I truly believe that Florida State is going to be tough as shit. Like, I think they're going to have, we'll get into, I guess, where our record predictions are. Christian, I feel like I'm rattling on here, buddy, but I'll kick it over to you. What do you got for me, man?
Yeah, man, I think you said it. I mean, I think you did a really good job there. You think about the traditional Florida State. They're one of those traditional blue blood programs in the sport of college football. But here's the reality of it, Chris, too. It's, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, sort of off air, and it's, Florida State to me, they're kind of like that. They're like the Texas of the ACC, I feel like. Every time they start to get some momentum and people start getting really high on them and they think that they're back, that's when they always just have a really shitty, fluke thing that happens, or they just have a down year. It's like right when you start expecting them to do something, they always shit the bed. Think about it. I mean, injuries. Okay, the rise of Clemson in this decade has really kind of screwed them. Right as the Jameis Winston era was winding down, that's really kind of hamstrung them. The other side of it is, speaking of Jameis Winston, ever since he left Tallahassee, They're looking for stability, man, at the quarterback spot. Now, I think they might have found it last year, in Jordan Travis, and I'll kind of get into him a little bit here, in a minute. But Mike Norvell, when I was doing this deep dive into this over the last weekend, he's 18-16 in 3 years, okay, at Florida State. They've only made it to a bowl game once, which was last year, in that Cheez-It Bowl, right? Which obviously goes to tell you, in his first 2 years, he didn't even have a winning season. He's averaged the 21st best recruiting class over his tenure at Florida State. Obviously, last year we talked about it. They finished 10-3 with a bowl win against Oklahoma last year. To me, what makes this so interesting, though, they had losses to Clemson, Wake Forest, and NC State. And this is a big thing that kind of defines the Mike Norvell era. It is going to be the thing that's going to define the Mike Norvell era at Florida State, and that is, what can he do when he goes up against top 25 teams? Do you know, in 3 years at Florida State, Chris, the man only has one top 25 win.
Wow. Right.
I mean, and that was UNC, I think, and that might have been his first year, if I'm not mistaken. So that's got to be that's the big thing. Now, some bright spots from what last year was first year offensive coordinator Alex Atkins, who's the line coach, right? He led the ACC in total offense, and he also had him ranked 23rd in the country in points per game. So the guy did a hell of a job last year. So, we kind of were talking about Jordan Travis and how important, and you touched on this about bringing somebody back, bringing
Obviously
back. That's such a huge thing. He had 3,600 yards last year and 31 touchdowns. I mean, he did a phenomenal job, I feel like, last year at kind of putting this together. Had a great season. I don't know if really preseason anybody was like super, super high on him going into last year. But
no.
This year, we kind of touched on this in our quarterback rankings. He's a preseason top 10 quarterback. A lot of people think he's a top 3 quarterback. I didn't go that high on him. I had him ranked at number 6 last year. But again, that's just like I said. I mean, I think he can certainly do some great things this year in the right system there. Primarily, and you touched on Trey Benson. He had over 1,000 all-purpose yards last year, 9 touchdowns.
Very underrated, by the way. Very underrated as a rusher.
Absolutely. And they're also bringing back their backup running back last year, who also had 725 yards to go alongside 6 touchdowns. I mean, this is a team that they're going to want to try to pound the rock on you. And I always like that, man. When teams can kind of run the ball and you've got a dynamic quarterback back there, you've got a shot, man.
Absolutely.
Here's something crazy, Chris. And this, to me, this is what really makes this, really interesting here. They're bringing back both of their leading receivers from last year here. Let me do this here. Let me kind of get everything set up here for you.
I can tell you one of those is Johnny Wilson, brother. I mean, that guy can play, dude. Very underrated wide receiver, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're bringing back Johnny Wilson and Micah Pittman. Combined last year, they had 1,230 yards, 8 touchdowns.
Right.
So, I mean, they've got a shot. I mean, like we said, anytime you can bring that kind of production back, you're doing something right, obviously.
Yeah, no, and to touch on what, just with the preview here, man, you're exactly right. Like, Florida State, they God, I guess I'm one of these people where obviously you called me a geriatric fuck most of the time, but like, I just remember that name is such a blue blood mentality with me when you hear Florida State. And I know that part of the country still holds them to the standard. And I can compare them a lot to Nebraska. And that's why when I hear Florida State, I kind of literally compare them to Nebraska. You know what I mean? They've had like crazy dominant eras of, the 80s, into the 80s, 90s for sure, 2000s. And then they taper off, and now they've been down, and, Bobby Bowden's not there anymore. They've had Jimbo Fisher, that crazy year, I believe it was 2013, with Winston, and then they've been fighting to try to get up there. And you just hear Florida State. It's kind of like Nebraska. You just think, if you've been around as long as I have, where you think like, that's just a great program. That's a powerhouse program, right? And that's where I put Florida State, Christian. I really, truly do, man. I'm a little bit older than you, obviously, but like, that's where you put them. And last year, they finally got the quarterback I think that you could kind of put up there. I'm not saying he's going to put up the numbers Jameis did, dude. That was a crazy year in 2013, I believe. But he is a front runner, for the Heisman. You bring back this. I mean, look at the damn screen here. This kind of production, bro. I mean, it's hard not to be successful with that in the ACC. I mean, you're really competing with what? Clemson, UNC, I think is kind of a dark horse sleeper team in there. I mean, there'll be another team. We don't know who it is. This is usually how it works in conferences. But like Florida State, man, this year, I believe they're preseason top 5, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, they're projected to be really, really good this year. I hate to say this, I don't always agree with projections, but I truly think that they're going to be way up there. I mean, they are going to be a team competing. I probably, we'll touch on this here in a little bit here, but I truly believe that they're going to be way up there, and Florida State should have a good year. If they don't, it's a failure. It really is. I mean, it truly is. They bring back a ton of people, and I am huge on bringing back people, especially in today's game.
Yeah, I mean, you exactly said it right. I mean, they also went out and got some help in the transfer portal. They're bringing in South Carolina's tight end from last year, Jaheim Bell. He kind of had an all right year last year. He put up 231 yards and 3 touchdowns last year. I think he's going to have a big season this year with him. I think Jordan Travis is going to try to figure out any way he can to get him the ball. He's going to be replacing a tight end in Cameron McDonald. I mean, McDonald didn't have, all that great of a year last year, as he only had, where was he at here? Let me scroll down here. At Cameron McDonald, he had 21 catches, 312 yards, and he had 1 touchdown. So, if they can get the tight ends kind of going too, then man, that could be I'm a huge fan anytime you can get a tight end involved. I think you are too, right?
Oh, for sure, 100%. Tight end is become more like, not to go off topic here, is starting to, college football copies what the NFL does, essentially, and vice versa. Like, tight ends become so huge in the NFL the last 5 years. You can see the college game is starting to do that too, right? Where you really start incorporating the tight end, not just as a fucking pass blocker, or run blocker, I should say. You're catching balls, right? Alabama does start to really do that with their guys. Georgia does it. You know that. I mean, that it's become a real hidden weapon. And if you get a good tight end, man, whew, I mean, all I got to do is use the name Travis Kelce. I mean, that guy's probably the number 1 wide receiver in the NFL, and he's a tight end, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because here's the thing, he can outbody safeties, and he can outrun linebackers.
Yep.
I mean, and you think about what that does for the outside guys. Now, Kansas City's obviously lost some of their outside guys, but it almost doesn't matter when you've got that kind of connection and you can get on the same page as a tight end or somebody like Travis Kelce. I mean, it just helps that offense kind of hum along here a little bit.
Yep, and I think that's exactly what a lot of college teams are starting to do. They're starting to find these guys that are athletes, right? That at tight end, like, hey, let's just use them in the slot, or use them out of a tight set. And yeah, you got a linebacker on him. Well, fuck, the guy's 6'5". He's faster than your linebacker is. He's bigger than your safety is. You get 2 fast guys on the outside, that takes your corners out of the position. I mean, it just works. I mean, it's a smart way to go about things. And you see Travis Kelce exploit the shit out of that. And he don't even have that good of receivers at Kansas City last year, and they still win a Super Bowl. So it's like, I'm not, no offense to Kansas City fans, but like, your receivers aren't Tyreek Hill and stuff. So like, it's like, you can't stop it. And I think college football is kind of trying to go that way, and they have been kind of doing that thing with, some of the tight ends out there lately. And it's like, damn, man, this makes sense. And like you said, I know we're really digging deep in the tight end position right here, but I mean, Christian, you're on the same page as I am with this, dude. You got a good tight end in the game. 90% of the time, your team is really, really good too. So I think we're on pace there as far as like what we think of Florida State's preview, and as far as like where they're projected this year. I think me and you are relatively pretty high on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of gives way, I think, to the biggest question mark for what they're going to do this year. That's on defense. Now, Statistically, last year, you might get a little misled. They finished ranked 15th in total defense last year.
And that's good.
That is, right? That is pretty good. But here's the thing, too. They finished ranked 10th in total sacks last year. I think they had like 40 of them. So obviously, Adam Fuller, he did a good job of getting them turned around. This is why I said it's kind of a little bit misleading. They didn't really force a ton of turnovers, especially in the secondary. So it's a situation where once they went up against those teams that we're talking about that are inside the top 25, they really kind of got exposed, I feel like, at certain points last year. So they're kind of like, who do we talk about? They're kind of like, one of those Big 12 teams that we always talk about, like Oklahoma or some of those teams that They don't really have that great of a defense, but they just benefit from just playing like weaker competition, right? Or USC, I think, or somebody like that.
Yeah, and to touch on that, it's crazy you bring up when somebody says, "Hey, your defense was 15th last year out of 100 and some odd teams." Well, yeah, that's really fucking good. Problem is, though, is like you just mentioned it. I'm a big person when I look at defensive stats: pressures, sacks, turnovers. Turnovers is the big one, right? Usually, you always hear before every game, you hear every commentator in the fucking world say, "Hey, if you win the turnover battle, you win 80% of the time," and they're exactly right about that. And I think Florida State's defense it's not that they're trashed. I mean, they bring back a majority of these guys. And in the ACC, where no offense to the ACC, but the offenses aren't like the SEC, right? Like they're just not from top to bottom, right? So I think Florida State's going to be okay on that end. And that's where I mentioned right away before we started talking about this. I said, hey, if their defense can get those turnovers, can make some key stops, that makes, because their offense, in my opinion, Christian, is going to be better than last year. I truly, truly believe that. And they had a great offensive season last year. If their defense really steps up, I think that takes them into, hey, you're competing for the ACC title. You win that fucking thing, and you're playing for what we would call the playoff next year. And I think Florida State's got a good chance to get in there. I'm not knocking them on that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here later. But I think Florida State's in that conversation. I maybe you don't agree with me. I know you're big on Clemson, but I truly think that they have a really legitimate shot, and it would not surprise me as a college football fan to see Florida State in the playoff.
It's going to shock the shit out of me, but we'll get into that later on.
Whoa, good. We need a little controversy.
We do, for sure. But yeah, you said it exactly right. And when you said you're really big when somebody can get sacks and create pressure. And Jared Verse for them last year did a fantastic job at that. He led the way. He had 9 sacks last year for him. Nice. He's coming back. He's going to have to replicate that same production this year if they want to keep him on pace. Sometimes you can have sort of a down year. You can have a really good like outlier type year. I feel like as a pass rusher, you can get a whole lot of sacks, create a lot of pressure. Then all of a sudden, you start landing on some preseason lists, and then it kind of teams start double teaming you, and it just you don't quite have that same impact. Now, if that starts happening this year where you start facing a lot of double teams, I mean, Florida State, they have some athletes. I mean, there was another guy in Patrick Payton, who's a defensive end for him, who can, he had 5 sacks last year. I mean, if they can create some of those mismatches, that guy might actually step up and have a little bit better year, right? So that'd be pretty good. They also bring back, both their linebackers and Bethune and Deloche. They combined for 147 tackles, 6 sacks, and 9 pass deflections last year. So, I mean, getting both those guys back, and having sort of a solid front 7 up there, that's going to be a huge thing for them. Secondary, and that's really where I have the biggest question mark for them here, is they're going to be led by safety Akeem Dent and cornerback Renardo Green. They combined for 111 tackles and 9 pass deflections. Chris, this is ultimately where this kind of leads to. They need the other safety, and the other cornerback / nickel backs, right, to kind of step up and be more stingy as well. They've got to have more interceptions. They've got to turn the ball over. They got to create more havoc, and they got to kind of tighten up that pressure, especially when they're facing off against Clemson,
UNC,
some of the LSU, some of these teams that they're going to play this year. They have to be able to do that.
Yep. No, and I 100% agree. And I'm glad you touched on the players. I figured you would dig deep into your stats there, as you always do, Christian. You do a great job with that. I just exactly. If you have a stingy defense, you use the word stingy. And I love that. Like in a defense, you might not be great, between the 20s all the time, right? But when you got to lock down, can you lock down, right? And we're talking about inside the red zone. Forcing field goals instead of touchdowns, right? And I think if Florida State can get to that point, kind of what the great teams do. Georgia, I know that gives you a boner, and you're getting excited over there with all that Georgia shit behind you. That's what they do. That's what great teams. Bama's done that in the past, right? They do that most every year. Ohio State has been notorious for doing that, right? Their defense is never really highly that talked about all the time, but man, tough to score on when you're inside the 20. Michigan's another team that, we can talk about those teams, and if Florida State can kind of, and they bring back a lot of those guys, the guys that you just mentioned, right? They can bring back those guys, and those guys can come back and build on what they did last year. I think Florida State, I know, like I said, we'll get into this, is that I'm very high on Florida State personally. I really, truly am. I think they're going to have a really great year this year. But a lot with me taking them from a top 8 team to a top 4 team, all is resting on their defense for me personally.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the offense, we know, hey, once you get kind of an established offense, you get that production there and you've proven it, and you can bring that production back and sort of add some pieces that you might be weak in through the transfer portal. I mean, you're pretty well good. I mean, I think same thing on defense for them. They just have to take that step forward in big games and really replicate that. So